April 29th, 2001. Russia invades Chernarus and begins its occupation of the country. They claimed Chernarus was once part of the Soviet Union and still belonged to them. NATO didn't take the threat seriously. They believed after the Soviet Union had dissolved that they wouldn't have to worry about Russia anymore. They couldn't have been more wrong, of course. It took a month after Russia's occupation of Chernarus before NATO demanded that Russia remove its military presence from Chernarus. Russia declined to send an answer back, seeing NATO as a fascist world military force that wouldn't back their words with military force. American, British, and German troops were the first to mobilize and formed the NATO Chernarus Expeditionary Force. They had their eyes set on Chernarus and pushing the Russians out. Their combined naval forces converged into the Green Sea, preparing for what would become the largest amphibious assault since Normandy. It was called Operation Makofin. It would be the first of many conflicts in the Third World War. The invasion was to happen along the southern coastline of Chernarus, to hopefully take two of the largest cities within days of their landings. Chernogorsk and Elektrozotsk were the ultimate targets in the first weeks of the campaign. Before they could start landing troops, though, they needed to disable radio towers and artillery along the coast, where they planned to land. In the night, they brought special operations to shore, hoping to get them behind enemy lines before the Russians noticed them. American Special Forces, Navy SEALs, German KSK, and British SBS. Basically an all-star roster of NATO's most experienced operators. July 7th, at 0600 hours. Only 4 hours before the Marines would land, they began to execute their operations. Their missions were generally speaking successful. They disabled all their radio tower targets and most of the major artillery pieces, and generally went unnoticed. They're the best at what they do. At 10 in the morning, the 2nd Marine Division was in position. 1st Battalion was to land at Kamenka, 2nd Battalion at Komarovo, and 3rd Battalion at Balota. They were only expected to be met with light resistance. After all, they were landing miles away from Chernogorsk along a lightly inhabited coastline. This wasn't 1944, this was 2001. The scope of military intelligence had changed drastically. They knew the attack would happen along the southern coast, and the Russians were able to fortify along the entire coastline. Balota was especially fortified to protect the airfield. Machine gun nests, bunkers, AT launchers, hedgehogs, mines. It was an absolute death trap. You can only imagine what it would have been like as your amphibious assault vehicle slowly moved towards the beach, bullets raining down on you from every angle, explosions ripping vehicles to shreds. These men were thinking of how desperately they wanted to get out of there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. When the doors opened and Marines came pouring out, it was instant chaos. Less than 50 feet away were entrenched Russians throwing every bullet they had at those poor Marines. PKMs were tearing men to pieces, and every defender had their AK trained on the men that were desperately crawling up the beach with no cover. NATO attacked too quickly, making the mistake of thinking they could pull off another D-Day. This wasn't World War II though. Every Russian had a fully automatic rifle, not a bolt action. AKs can shoot 100 rounds a minute versus an average 10 rounds a minute of the bolt-action rifles. PKM machine gun could shoot almost 750 rounds a second. This meant a lot of bullets were in the air when the Marines hit the beach. Staff Sergeant Marriott of 3rd Battalion described what he saw at Balota Beach. A wall of death. A hailstorm of lead. Those in the first wave were cut down before they could take 2 steps. Casualties were high. In under 10 minutes, almost 80% of the first wave was dead on that beach. The only reason we were able to hold a foothold on the beach was because of the amphibious APCs. Men took shelter behind them when they realized they had no cover to push up the beach. Many of the APCs were destroyed by artillery, but the second wave was arriving in time to help them push. At all 3 landings, the Marines surged up the beaches to take their objectives, Kamenka, Komarovo, and Balota. The fighting waged on through the morning as intense door-to-door skirmishes broke out in the towns, fighting street to street in a terrifying close-quarters battle. The Marines found themselves held back by the might of the Russian soldiers that held their ground. It took many more lives to finally secure the towns. The battle for Balota Airfield was particularly brutal. Marines from the 2nd and 3rd Battalion had managed to consolidate their forces at this time and met in Balota, but found large numbers of Russian infantry holding the airfield itself. This was the 78th Russian Guards headquarters. They oversaw the defense of the southwest coastline and were reluctant to give any ground to the Marines. They threw everything they had at the advancing Marines. They had mortar pits, artillery pieces, armor, motorized vehicles, and many lives to spare still before the Marines could advance any farther.